Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is May 6, 2001, and my guest is Tim Harford, author and columnist for the Financial Times. His latest book is Adapt: Why Success Always Starts with Failure. Tim, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks very much, Russ. Nice to be on the show again.
Before we begin, I want to let listeners know we're trying something a little different today with our technology for recording the program. It's an experiment. It may be a failure that leads to success, or it may be an outright success. Either way, let us know what you think of the sound quality of today's podcast by dropping me an email at mail@econtalk.org. Now let's turn to Tim and his book, Adapt. Tim, what is the connection between success and failure that you trace out in the book?
It's quite simply that in a complex world, and I begin the book by trying to explain how complex the world really is, this amazing society that we've created, this very complex economy we've created. In a complex world, there's a lot of failure, and that needn't necessarily be anything to worry about. Very successful economies have very high levels of failure. Successful organizations have high levels of failure. But we can't really get away from this failure. And so a key skill is being able to manage it and respond to it and learn from it. And I really began by examining the capability of markets to do that, and I know that's something you and your listeners will appreciate. But I was also very interested in whether other organizations could do the trick, what the political obstacles to learning from failure were, and even what the individual obstacles were. You know, why, although I'm not a psychologist and although it's mostly an economics book, I did want to ask, why is it that you and I struggle to respond constructively? Why does failure hurt us so much?
Yeah, you can speak for yourself. Most of us never fail, so it's easy to respond to it. You never have to. Now, it is a fascinating question of how difficult it is psychologically for us to accept failure, and I want to come to some of those psychological issues. I hope we have time for that at the end. You emphasize at various points in the book F.A. Hayek's understanding of local knowledge and what he called the particular circumstances of time and space. Why are those important? What's important about local knowledge?
Where this emerged, and this I don't think is what Hayek was originally thinking of, although he may well agree. Where this emerged was actually when I was looking at the experience of the U.S. Army in Iraq. And it emerged in a tank battle, of all places. So what's going on? This is the first Gulf War. And there is a group of 9 American tanks called Eagle Troop. And they're barreling along the desert in the middle of a sandstorm. And in some ways, the first Gulf War was a triumph for the planner's view of how a war should be. So you have this wonderful conceit of the guy at the top with all these big screens, satellite images and video footage from planes. He can see everything. He's got battlefield maps. He can make decisions about the whole governance of this war from a air-conditioned tent in Qatar or in Washington, D.C. even. And the experience of this group of tanks maybe said, well, maybe it's not quite that simple. Maybe you can't always rely on centralized control, even in a war, even with that level of technology. Because these tanks came over the crest of a sand dune in this sandstorm. They had no satellite cover. They had no air cover. And they ran into nearly 100 tanks and armored personnel carriers, dug in, defensive emplacements, and they're Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard. They're the elite guys.
And how many tanks did the Americans have?
They had 9 tanks, so they're outnumbered 10-1.
Okay.
Now, the captain of Eagle Troop, he is the man with the knowledge of the specific circumstances of time and place. He's the only guy who can make the decision. He can't call back to base. He can't call in support. He can't say, hey, what does our map say? Because it's all gone down. He's got to make the decision. And he's got to make the decision incredibly quickly, using the local information he has, evaluating the disposition of the enemy troops, the disposition of his own men, what the chances are. And he made an instant decision. He said, if we try and turn around, we're all going to die. We've got to attack. We're surprised, but they're surprised too. And he yelled out, fire Sabo, which is telling his gunner to use anti-tank munitions, and they instantly destroyed an Iraqi tank. 3 seconds later, they destroyed another. And 3 seconds later, they destroyed another. And then the other 8 tanks came over the ridge. They all opened up, and very quickly, they'd won the battle. Now, that sounds a bit like a piece of Tom Clancy. And in fact, it was written up by Tom Clancy. And it's a celebrated battle that was supposed to indicate the tremendous superiority of the U.S. Army and the U.S. strategy. And in some ways, it did. But the captain who experienced that situation, he came away with a different conclusion. He said, look, we all nearly died. And the reason we didn't die is because I had to make a split-second decision. In other words, it didn't work the way it was supposed to work. It didn't work in a top-down way. I had to make the decision. And he campaigned, and there's a lot of sort of very thoughtful men and women in the U.S. military. And he campaigned, wrote a series of papers and analyses saying, you need to give more attention to the training and responsibility of the troops on the ground, whether it's ordinary soldiers, whether it's captains, colonels. Later on, that became hugely important. He did 2 things. First of all, he wrote a very respected history of the war in Vietnam, analyzing the failures of leadership, both political and military, and looking at some of the groupthink and the way that very dubious forecasts were made and the truth wasn't conveyed to the president, and the president didn't really want to hear the truth, and there were a lot of yes men around. Analyzed this whole thing, blistering account, very widely read in the army. And then he did something even more important. And this is in the spring of 2005. He was a colonel now in Iraq, and his name is Colonel H.R. McMaster. And he was responsible for U.S. operations near a city called Tal Afar. And what Colonel McMaster did was pioneer a new way of dealing with insurgents that was very responsive to what was going on the ground, very intensive, very difficult, risky for his men, but also risky for his career, because at the same time that this was going on, the top brass, Donald Rumsfeld, he didn't want to even hear the word insurgent. So this was literally didn't want to hear it. Literally, there's a famous press conference. This is a few months after the Tal Afar campaign started and McMaster was developing these techniques. There's a famous press conference just after Thanksgiving weekend, 2005. Donald Rumsfeld and Peter Pace, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, talking to the Pentagon press corps, and Rumsfeld's going through these bizarre Orwellian contortions to avoid the word insurgent. And a journalist even called him on it. He said, why are you not using the word, sir? He said, well, I've had an epiphany over Thanksgiving, and I've realized these men don't deserve to be called insurgents. And then Peter Pace, the most senior general in the U.S. military, is sort of trying to talk about the problems in Iraq and apologizing to Rumsfeld. It's all a bit jokey, saying, well, sorry, sir, I can't really think of a better word than insurgent right now. And just absolutely bizarre. And if it was just a press conference, it wouldn't matter, but actually that was rife throughout the U.S. military. Senior officers were saying, we don't use the I word, it's not an insurgency. This is a bit bizarre. It could have been straight out of 1984. Very top-down, trying to control even the language, and it meant the strategy was just failing. And more important than the fact that the strategy was failing, because strategies do fail a lot, is there was no way to change the strategy. You couldn't even talk about what was going wrong, and that was something that H.R. McMaster pioneered. He wasn't the only one. There were several really brave colonels who put their careers on the line doing this, but I think he was one of the first. And something a British general told me while I was researching the book, which I think really struck home, and I think Hayek would recognize the sentiment. He said, we always implement lessons learned on the front line because lives are lost or saved by how quickly you do that. But we very rarely implement lessons learned at the top because there's just no pressure and no incentive to do so.
Yeah, one of the things I found, so fascinating about the use of the war example is that, yes, people on the ground have more knowledge. That sandstorm is a great example. Hayek talks a lot about how local knowledge that's in the heads of individuals, it's incredibly difficult to get it out of their heads. Often they don't even know what that knowledge is until they have to use it. How do you get it out of their heads into a central authority who would then make some decision and pass it back down? And the time and knowledge burden there, he called it the knowledge problem, is so large, it's basically an impossible problem that is not helped by having lots of computers. But you pointed, I think, to a separate problem, which is that the experts often struggle to come to the best decisions, even with the limited knowledge they have, because of groupthink, because of ego, because of the exercise of power. And the war in Vietnam was a great example of that McMaster chronicled, and similarly here in Iraq. It's not just that they don't have the right information; they're stuck in these grooves and ruts that they can't seem to get out of.
That's absolutely true, and there are various psychological processes at work. So you mentioned groupthink. So the classic study of groupthink is by Irving Janis, and it's a study of the Bay of Pigs fiasco, where I forget the exact numbers, but the basic conceit was the American administration of Kennedy was going to sponsor a couple of thousand untrained rebels, drop them in Cuba, and they were going to defeat a standing army of, say, 250,000 well-trained, experienced guys fighting on their own ground. Oh, and by the way, no one would ever figure out the U.S. was involved. Yeah. And on the face of it, you think, well, that's just crazy. No, how could anybody convince themselves that this would ever work? And what's interesting about Janis's study is he says it's not that Kennedy was a sort of Stalin-esque figure who suppressed dissent. He was trying to get people to tell him what they thought, but there were just social processes of people just didn't want to make a fuss, and people would look around this room. Kennedy's advisors would look around the room, and everybody else seemed to think it was a good idea, so they didn't want to kick up a fuss.
Well, it's also risky, right? So if it's a success, you're the guy who said you should be worried about it. You look like a fool. The safe, low-risk strategy is to agree with everybody else in the room.
Yeah, and then you can, no matter what happens,
you're fine.
You're no worse off. You're no worse off than anybody else.
Yeah.
So, and Kennedy later on, this is very interesting. When trying to think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, he actually split his expert advisors up and forced them to have separate discussions, and occasionally would bring them back together. He would also bring in experts from outside to deliberately design to shake things up, because he realized just asking people for their opinion, even if it was done very honestly, wouldn't necessarily work. So there's a lot of that. Another thing is people get very attached to their role in a hierarchical organization. Mm-hmm. There's an amazing statement that I mentioned in the book that's quoted by John Nagel, who is now at a Washington security think tank. He was a counterinsurgency expert in Iraq, and he wrote a book about counterinsurgency. And this amazing quote is from a senior U.S. Army officer during Vietnam, and he says, "I'll be damned if I'm going to ruin this army just to win the war." The idea is, if we adapt to the war we're fighting, then we're going to spoil everything. We've got it all worked out. It's all neat. We've got all our training programs and all our chains of command and everything, and you're just going to ruin everything just to win the war in Vietnam? That's crazy. And it really, when you pluck the quote out of context, it just sounds insane. But actually, I think we all know people who behave like that when they're facing a business problem or a policy problem. They're thinking, I could solve this problem, or I could save the current structure of my organization, and that's a lot safer, especially if I'm a senior person in that organization.
Yeah, I also thought about when I was reading that section, the accounts that I've read of the Battle of Gettysburg. I've not read a lot of military. I'm not a military battle enthusiast, but I've read a little bit about Gettysburg, and you're just struck, and I think this would be true of any large battle, you're struck with how much ignorance there is. And the great generals aren't the ones who sit there in that room and push the pieces around like pawns on a chessboard. They're the ones who teach their underlings how to freelance and deal with uncertainty, like the story you told of McMaster in Iraq. General Lee at Gettysburg, the story goes that he really missed Stonewall Jackson because he trusted him. And here was a guy who had seen freelance, knew what he did that was right, and I think one of the reasons Lee failed at Gettysburg is that he didn't trust the guys he had on the ground, and he was waiting for information, which he was horribly misinformed, all inevitably because of the problems that we're talking about. So, the fog of war is just, I think, one of the most dramatic examples of the challenge of top-down versus bottom-up.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's very interesting to reflect on how changing technology changes this balance.
Mm-hmm.
We, I think, naturally assume that better communications and better computers, more information, helps the guy at the center. And this is something, it was a fantasy, I guess it goes back to, say, Salvador Allende in Chile.
Tell that story. Tell that story, because that's an amazing story that I actually didn't know. Until very recently, and I didn't know the details.
So Allende hooked up with a cybernetic theorist called Stafford Beer, who was British. And so Allende was a sort of a democratically elected Marxist leader in Chile in the early 1970s. And it's fair to say he had a lot to deal with. There was a lot of economic hostility from the U.S. There was possible sabotage. There was a lot of strikes. I mean, he had a lot of problems that were not necessarily his fault. But nevertheless, his strategy for dealing with Chile's economic situation was, well, it was basically a technological love affair. He was going to get really amazing computers. And Stafford Beer was going to plug these computers into the Chilean economy, and these computers would process all this information, and literally at 5 o'clock every day, they would print out a report, and the report would go to Allende, and Allende would be able to give directions, and it'd all be sent back. It was telex machines. People would telex in information about what was going on in their factories, and these big computers would process the information. The most famous visual remnant of this was a control room that looks like something out of Star Trek. It's got swivel chairs with buttons in and screens, and actually was never operational. They never plugged it in, but it became a symbol of this project called CyberSyn. It became a symbol both to people who wanted to mock it and to its proponents. Now, the funny thing is about Allende's project, the supercomputer he was using was called a Burroughs 3500, and my father actually worked all his life for Burroughs, which later merged and became Unisys. So at the beginning of his working career, which was, I think, 1969, he was actually working on this kind of computer. So I was able to sit down with my dad and have a great conversation about what these computers could and couldn't actually do. And of course, 1970, he said it's not even a supercomputer by the standards of the 1970s. It was a good, solid kind of computer that you put in the back office of a bank, and it would sort of sort out people's accounts and so on. It was very, very reliable. Hard drives, literally the size of washing machines. He said you'd get a physical workout moving this thing around, but just so much less powerful than a modern iPhone.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not even funny how much less powerful than a modern iPhone this computer was. And it did not work. And I think one of the clear reasons why it didn't work is there's no reason for people, irrespective of the processing power, there's no reason for people to telex in the truth if the truth is not convenient to them. And even if they did want to telex in the truth, it could be that the bandwidth available just doesn't really convey what's really important, the opportunities or the problems that are really going on for a particular factory. Funnily enough, the only time that CyberSyn really worked was during the strikes, when basically the information was really simple, which is, hey, these guys, the strikers have shut down our factory, we can't produce anything. That sort of information CyberSyn could process, but the more subtle information needed to run an economy, it just it was a complete failure.
Well, this, of course, is a dream that goes back to the 1920s. It goes back before that, but there was this famous debate called the calculation debate in economics over whether you could centrally plan an economy. And this was before they had computers, right? They were imagining the idea that if you had enough information and could process it, you could assign the right prices to the products, the right quantities to the factories, and in theory, you could do even better than the market. But of course, as Hayek and Mises argued, you'd actually do dramatically worse, and they won that intellectual debate more or less. We had an interesting podcast with Pete Boettke over whether the opponents conceded defeat or not, and some of the details of the debate. But we'll put a link up to that. But basically, the world's realized that computers aren't smart enough. It's not simply a question of processing a lot of information. It's information that's subtle. It's the particular circumstances of time and place, that where the next supply increase could come from, what might be the cheapest way to get it available, what substitutes are available. All that information can never be easily put into a computer or answered on a survey. So it's really a utopian fantasy.
It's really very interesting to look at the empirics on this as well. What's the evidence as technology has progressed beyond anything that Hayek or his intellectual opponents could have dreamed of? Has that changed things, and how are people actually using it? Now, on the battlefield, clearly there's no price system on the battlefield, and it is somewhat helpful for the guy in central command to know what's going on. There are things that can be coordinated.
Absolutely.
Especially the sorts of one-off lightning strikes that began the war in Iraq, that sort of thing. The shock and awe, you can do very well, and you don't have a price mechanism, and you probably don't want to delegate authority completely to the people on the front line.
All right, you want to coordinate that from the top down.
Yeah, but many problems, including the counterinsurgency problem, trying to sort of deal with the local population, get them to cooperate, protect them from terrorists and insurgents. That's actually something that's very hard to coordinate centrally, and you need to trust the guys on the ground. But of course, the presence of things like email, news groups, to some extent empowers the central command, but it also hugely empowers the guys on the ground. They can swap information on bulletin boards about the latest improvised explosive devices, roadside bombs. What are the latest tricks? What's going on in your area? They could swap hints and tips. There's a brilliant PowerPoint presentation called "How to Win the War in Al-Anbar" by Captain Trav. Al-Anbar was a particularly troublesome province. It was a really early victory in the counterinsurgency campaign that became the Surge. And Captain Trav was this sort of cartoon character who, with these stick figures, would explain how to talk to people, how to treat people, what the basic fundamental problem was with the insurgency. And this PowerPoint presentation was just passed around, and it was really easy to do so. It didn't have to be printed off somewhere in Colorado and then shipped out to Iraq and distributed. It was passed around like samizdat. So these people were able to communicate with each other. I should say, one of the things that I really found amazing about writing the book is I had never really thought about these military problems before, and I've always been an economist. And it is striking how important the decisions these men had to make, the pressure they were under, and the risks they were taking. Captain Trav himself was actually called Captain Travis Patriquin, and he died just before Christmas in 2006 and left behind a widow and 3 children. And the thing that I never forget is reading that all the local sheikhs came to his funeral because he was so respected. He really understood how things worked in that province. He'd formed all these alliances, and the locals respected him. So it's a little different from writing about economics. But I do try and draw these economic lessons. And so one of the things I wanted to do was say, well, what happens when technology bursts onto the scene in an organization? There's some great work by Eric Brynjolfsson of MIT showing that, this is about 10 years old now, but showing there's a really strong connection between new technology and decentralization of responsibility. They go hand in hand. You can either keep your old technology and your old centralization in an organization, or you can decentralize responsibility, give people much more flexibility, and also introduce the new technology, and that will work really well. But you need to do one or the other. You can't decentralize without the technology, and you can't introduce the technology profitably without decentralizing. That was a very interesting thing to reflect on. It's not at all obvious that new technology is a force for centralization.
Yeah, I was just I can't avoid noting I'm just doing some light reading. I'm reading a 2,208-page report on the Lehman bankruptcy. Really a delightful bedtime experience. And it's an audit by the government. I think it's a government auditor of what went wrong. And he just mentions, the guy who authored the report, just mentioned in the beginning that the universe, I'm reading from the report, the universe of Lehman email and other electronically stored documents is estimated at 3 petabytes of data, roughly the equivalent of 350 billion pages. So, one of the, as you talk about it, you think about how technology allows decentralization, allows the sharing of information. You'd think it would allow the top-down to be even more effective. But, of course, when you have 350 billion pages, you have no chance of doing anything from the top down. And so I think one of the fascinating things, as you point out, is how technology has made it easier to do bottom-up, and how, the top-down, the people who run an organization, whether it's the military or a corporation, have to put in place some kind of structure for the bottom-up to emerge and also to trust it. And I do want to make it clear, and you obviously this runs through your book. When we talk about bottom-up, we don't mean unplanned. It doesn't mean that everything's random, everybody's freelancing. It means that the knowledge and the use of that knowledge is coming from the bottom. But, of course, in any organization, there's, whether it's the military or a corporation or public policy, there's lots of planning that goes on.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And talking about Lehman Brothers, one of the chapters that I most enjoyed writing and really learned a lot about was thinking about the financial crisis, which is a huge challenge for economists and for economics. And in this particular case, I found myself being drawn to a literature that I hadn't explored before on industrial accidents. And this is a literature that economists have pretty much nothing to say about, and it's dominated by engineers, psychologists, and a couple of sociologists who are doing great work on how complex systems go wrong. And looking at the Challenger shuttle disaster, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. Of course, more recently we've had Fukushima and Deepwater Horizon, a really terrible oil rig accident in the UK called Piper Alpha. Piper Alpha is what got me interested, actually, because Piper Alpha triggered a small financial crisis in the British insurance industry. So I thought, hey, I'll write about that financial crisis, a mini financial crisis, because it'll be a way into the big financial crisis, and I'd better write about what happened on Piper Alpha. And then the more I read about what happened on Piper Alpha, the more I realized, hey, this is a complex system, and the people who were trying to understand why it went wrong, they're producing amazing stuff that's absolutely relevant to the financial crisis, and part of it is ensuring that people who are in a position to see what's going on the ground actually have the incentives and the motivation and the right monitoring to do the right thing, because there are different ways things can go wrong. The psychologist James Reason talks about 3 kinds of error. He says there's slips, mistakes, and violations.
Yeah.
So a slip is you just do something, you immediately realize that wasn't what you meant to do. You push the wrong button, you lock yourself out of your house, your car keys, your keys are inside the house, that kind of thing. Mistakes are things you do because your view of the world was wrong. So you took out a subprime mortgage and bought a house because you thought the house prices would continue to rise and you would be able to remortgage your house. That's a mistake. And then there's a violation.
Yeah.
And a violation is something you know is against the rules, but you did it anyway for whatever reason. So maybe you falsified your income claim. There are violations that take place on oil rigs, violations that take place in nuclear power stations, and there are violations that took place on Main Street, and violations that took place on Wall Street. And one of the things that interested me was, and this is about trust, we devote a lot of attention to distinguishing between mistakes and violations, because violations, someone should go to jail. Mistakes are human. They're honest mistakes.
Yeah.
They're human. But actually, there is a there is something they have in common that's very important, which is they can both just sit there and come back to bite you days, weeks, even years after the original mistake. And that happens in industrial accidents. If somebody leaves a valve open or there's a safety system that's disabled, and you don't find out about it until it's crisis point. But that also happened in the financial crisis. People were investing in instruments that were supposed to be safety systems. They were supposed to be insurance. The regulators had approved them. Top management had approved them, and it was all going to, if something went wrong, don't worry, it was all covered, and it was all hedged, and it was all insured. And then when it comes to the crunch, suddenly you realize the safety system doesn't work. And whether it's a mistake or a violation maybe doesn't matter as much as, hey, how do we spot that an error has been made in the system and uncover it before the critical moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting analogy, and when you look at some of these stories, and I've read some of them as well before I saw them in your book, what you notice is that the incentives get changed by the safety systems. So
absolutely,
a lot of times in industrial accidents, people aren't so worried when they see something going wrong because they know there's a backup. What they don't realize is it's Tuesday, and on Tuesday between 3 and 4 o'clock, the backup is shut down for evaluation. And you have these weird, you give these examples in the book of where remarkably strange things happen in sequence that you wouldn't have expected. But of course, every once in a while, you get a black swan. They all line up, and you get a catastrophe. For me, what's interesting is the incentives for care, and I'm. Both slips and mistakes are, they're part of being human. Inevitably, you make slips, and inevitably, you make mistakes. But what you want to do is give people some incentive to avoid them. And if the incentives aren't there, then you're going to see a lot more of both. So I wonder, and listeners know this is my take on the crisis. I'm just going to throw it out there, let you talk about it, and we'll move on. But when you have a system where people think they're going to be potentially bailed out, their desire and intensity to focus on the potential for mistakes and potential for slips is smaller. In particular, you're going to say, well, you evaluate risk. It doesn't work so well as a monitor of real risk, but it's not so bad if it fails. Or, yes, I'm insured, but what if the insurer fails? That is a thing that any savvy person would worry about. And these savvy people knew that everybody was insured with AIG and other firms like it. So it's strange that they went to bed sleeping well at night. That's the challenge as to why they weren't more vigilant about the potential for the catastrophe. Maybe it's just a mistake, maybe it's a slip, or maybe the incentives are wrong.
Yeah, my feeling is I think it's a bit of both. I don't fully buy the idea that all of this stuff was extreme laziness or even sort of willful fraud because everybody knew the government would bail them out. I don't think it was that gross, but I do accept that there was clearly weighing on some people's minds was the likelihood of a government bailout. I think particularly people who were lending money to banks. Exactly, and that was a problem. I mean, it's interesting to go back to the parallel with, say, a nuclear accident. You could say, well, we don't need any government oversight or any industry oversight of a nuclear power plant because, hey, who is the person who's going to suffer most of all if there's a nuclear accident? Well, first of all, it's going to be the operators. They're there. They're in the front line. They're the ones who are going to get the dose of radiation. And financially, who's going to suffer? It's going to be the power company who owns the nuclear facility. So I think you could say, well, the incentives are pretty good. I think you still want systems that help out. The problem is regulators do sometimes get captured. They end up supporting the industry rather than properly regulating it. So you're always on the lookout for systems that work. When I talk to people in the nuclear industry, what I was struck by was they said, well, we've actually got a lot of peer oversight, which is a very powerful force potentially. We go and visit each other's power stations. We keep an eye on each other. And that's something that I think was a very weak force in banking. And maybe it's hard to see how it could be operationalized. But they inspect each other's nuclear power stations and they issue reports and they learn from each other. And you can sort of see how that would... Nobody in the nuclear industry wants a nuclear power plant to blow up. And they've got a strong incentive to keep an eye on each other. So I found this peer monitoring idea very interesting and useful, but hard to operationalize.
Yeah, and I think in the banking
finance.
case, you really don't want them visiting each other, spending a lot of time picking up bad ideas. Yeah, Arnold,
there are risks, clearly.
Arnold Kling, who's blogs at EconLog, a sister site of this program, and who a frequent guest, he makes an interesting distinction between easy to fix versus hard to break. And he argues that we have a tendency to try to find systems that will never fail. He says what we ought to really be doing is finding systems that maybe they fail occasionally, but when they do fail, they're easy to fix. The costs are small. Instead, we've gravitated towards the perfect regulation. We want to reduce the odds of any kind of failure to zero, which means when there is one, it's absolutely horrific.
I think Arnold is absolutely right. There's an insight from Nassim Taleb, of course, on this, which is that these rare catastrophes, it's very hard to say exactly how rare they really are. Statistically, it's almost impossible to measure them because they are rare. And so going for making the catastrophe rare, but if it happens, it's going to be really, really big, is not necessarily a great strategy. So I think Arnold's right. I mean, the way an engineer would think about this is you want a system that's robust. If part of it breaks, that can be contained.
Yeah.
You don't want anything to be, in the phrase that's become very famous, don't want anything to be too big to fail.
Yeah.
And that's something I think we really need in our banking system, and whether that comes from a market discipline or whether it comes from regulators, we need to figure this out. It's not a simple problem. I don't think it's a simple problem to create a banking system where we can let banks fail with impunity. But I feel it's something that's got to be the way forward. And interestingly, in the UK, the Banking Commission, which is run by Sir John Vickers, who's an Oxford-based economist and actually one of my tutors, former head of the Competition Policy Authority in the UK, they've definitely pushed towards trying to make banks more modular so that you can sort of take a chunk out of a bank and rescue it and look after depositors and let the rest of the bank fail. You can break banks up and isolate failures so they don't become systemic problems. And that's clearly the direction regulation is pushing in the UK. I don't know how successful they'll be, but that's obviously the way they're thinking.
Yeah, the problem is that the bankers push back. They don't like that, and I think that's going to be the challenge. We'll see. But I want to move on. There's so many other interesting things to talk about. Now, we're going to skip over a couple issues you do explore in the book, which we're not going to have time for, which are the use of randomized experiments in fighting third world poverty. I think is very interesting, and you have some interesting things to say about the difficulties of figuring out how to live an environmentally correct life and some of the challenges. And basically what you explore in both those is the interconnections often make it difficult for any one individual to see what's going on, which has implications for what we should do. But I want to move on to some more general issues because I want to get into the psychology at the end as well. What are the lessons of ADAPT of your book for our personal lives?
I think the obvious lesson is almost a cliche, and I think what's interesting is how difficult that cliche turns out to be. So the cliche is, hey, learn from your mistakes, right?
Yep.
And we always say that, and I started to think, well, how come we keep saying that?
Yeah.
And it turns out to be so hard to do. I mean, if you wanted to generalize what I say in the book about how complex problems are solved, what sort of organizations or markets, what sort of systems solve complex problems, it's basically three things. This ties in a little bit to what you were talking about, what Arnold was saying, Arnold Kling. So one is you need to try a bunch of different stuff, a variety of things. Everyone can't be doing the same thing. Next, since failures will be common, it needs to be okay for some of that stuff to fail. That stuff can't, be a nuclear meltdown or a virus or a financial crisis that brings the system down. It's got to be. The failure has to be survivable. So,
yep.
Number one, diversity. Number two, survivability. And number three is you need to be able to tell the difference between a success and a failure.
Yeah.
And that sounds obvious, but it's
not
often
so
a problem.
obvious.
It's a problem. Yeah, I mean, it was a problem in the financial crisis where bankers were being paid bonuses based on apparent profits that turned out, there were accounting profits, but they weren't real economic profits because there were risks embodied that couldn't be measured. And governments have a real problem there to telling the difference between success and failure. It's often not in politicians' interests to measure whether their particular policies are succeeding or failing. That's often inconvenient knowledge. So yeah, those three things: diversity, survivability, and distinguishing between success and failure. And if you've got those three things, you have a very adaptive system that will very quickly try out good stuff, will cope with its failures, and will pick out the successes and replicate the successes. So then the question is, can you do that in your personal life? And it's not so easy. So think about the diversity, first of all. Clearly, we're just one person, so you can try out a bunch of different stuff, but it's easy to lose focus. I think that most people do tend to get stuck in a bit of a rut. I think they don't try out new experiences, new ideas, as much as they should. I reflected on my time as a university student. I had such a great time, and I think not everyone enjoys university, but many, many people do. And one of the reasons is you're experimenting with everything. You've got new friends, a new place, you're experimenting with ideas, you may be experimenting with things you shouldn't be experimenting with, but you're experimenting with a whole bunch of different stuff. Political ideologies, different hobbies, everything. It's so exciting, and yet it's so safe, because none of those things are really going to cause you a problem. As long as you in the end, focus, revise for your exams, pass your exams, and then you're through that. So it's a very safe space for experimentation. That's why it's so thrilling. But we really struggle to do that, I think, later in adult life. We get very conservative. The other thing that's difficult about having a diverse bunch of experiments in our lives, different projects, different things we like to do, maybe create a huge internet hit, a rap video, unexpected experiments.
Thank you.
Is that we all know about it. It's great, but these experiments, we know that they will likely not work out. Most new things don't work out, and we're too afraid of failures. And that's an insight that comes from behavioral economics. One of the first discoveries of the behavioral economics literature, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, loss aversion. The idea that taking a loss is disproportionately painful. And that makes it really hard to just try out these new things. But, I'm going to ask that person that I like out on a date. The fear of rejection. Why not? The upside would be great. The downside, she says no, he says no. That's such a big deal. But it's very painful. We don't like to take chances. And then the third thing, this idea of determining the difference between success and failure. That's also very hard. There's a huge amount of work on denial and also on unhelpful responses to failure. So what a poker player would call going on tilt. Effectively, you double down, you chase your losses. So there are different ways in which we can either respond in a bad way to failure, or we can deny that a failure has ever happened. And, we can talk more about any of those things, but all in all, it means that this advice, adapt, experiment, learn, grow, it's really good advice, but it's painfully difficult to take.
Yeah, I've been reading, I'm teaching a seminar this semester on Adam Smith, and I've been reading The Theory of Moral Sentiments, something we did a 6-part podcast with Dan Klein, as some of you may remember. And I as you talk about the difficulties of accepting failure, I'm reminded of the quote, "He is a bold surgeon," they say, "whose hand does not tremble when he performs an operation upon his own person. And he is often equally bold who does not hesitate to pull off the mysterious veil of self-delusion which covers from his view the deformities of his own conduct." And I think we have this very human impulse to gloss over our mistakes, to see them as successes. And I think part of growing up is learning to live with them and admit them and say, I don't know, or I made a mistake. And one of the things that that just fascinates me about the political world versus the business world. First of all, in the business world, mistakes are measured. Your company goes broke. You can't say it was a success. And so I think one of the fascinating things about American culture is supposedly is that, in Silicon Valley, they say you're not a success till you failed 2 or 3 times. And people expect that. They give you a second chance. That is a very wonderful thing. In politics, it seems that the cost of admitting a failure must be close to infinite, because both George Bush and Barack Obama, just to pick 2 recent examples, when asked if they'd made any mistakes, they just they don't seem to find them coming to mind. Those of us in the electorate can list dozens, but the men themselves. So it must be either that they're totally self-deluded, which could be, or they feel that by conceding even the smallest mistake, they open the door to negative ads and criticism, history. I find it interesting, though, that I really think it's more than that. I think it's not so much strategic as pathological and maybe necessary in some circumstances, not in presidents, but I think in some circumstances to go forward for people in various times in human history.
Absolutely. And partly it's down, I think, to the voters. I mean, I think one of the really memorable choices in U.S. political history, maybe I'm biased, I was in Washington, D.C., I was living in Washington at the time, so maybe it just made a big impact on me, but John Kerry, George Bush, and really the defining image of that campaign was that George Bush knew his mind and made decisions, and Kerry was a flip-flopper. And that was how the campaign was decided. Now, Kerry's defenders said, that's not fair, he's not a flip-flopper. He is decisive. Nobody defended Kerry by saying, hey, what's wrong with changing your mind? The world's a complicated place.
Yeah.
You should change how many of us, I think lots of people sort of were in support of the war in Iraq, for example, and then later they saw it wasn't going very well and they changed their mind and they said, oh, well, in retrospect, this has been a mistake. I mean, clearly, some people always thought it was a good idea and some people always thought it was a bad idea. But a lot of perfectly reasonable people changed their minds halfway through. That's an indication of sanity, and yet politically very toxic.
Right.
In the UK, our two most successful politicians are Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher. And here are the money quotes. For Tony Blair, I don't have a reverse gear. Margaret Thatcher, you turn if you want to. The lady's not for turning. They're two of their most famous quotes, and we elected them 3 times for Blair, 3 times for Thatcher. Most successful prime ministers in British history.
But of course, they also did.
We don't like people who change their minds.
Yeah, the irony is, though, of course, is that people we think of as very principled often break their principles relentlessly, but they're able to frame it as if they were principled. I think Ronald Reagan has this great reputation as this great free market capitalist president. He put on the effective quotas on Japanese cars. He put up with lots of increases in the size of government. He didn't stand up to Congress. He decided, prudently that he wouldn't win, I guess. But we somehow think he was this staunch defender of principle. He changed his mind in Lebanon, right, and decided to withdraw. Yeah. Oh, he would never do that. He's so strong. But he did it. But he has this image of being the strong person. And you talk about
as opposed to being a pragmatist. I mean, it's a strange thing that it's regarded as a strength. And what you just said about Reagan changing his mind on this and that, would be regarded as a criticism. Whereas in some cases, maybe he was absolutely right.
Right.
It's interesting to reflect on what does that do to the incentives for politicians, and I think it's a fascinating contrast between both markets and also the scientific method. So in the case of markets and in the case of the scientific method, basically one success makes up for a lot of failures. You have a whole bunch of failed theories. You've got one theory that works. Because there's a selection process that we start to believe the theory that works better, that has the better evidence behind it. The same with markets. A whole bunch of stores that go out of business, and that's sad for their owners and for their employees, but people pick themselves up again, people find jobs again. The one successful business can employ a lot of people, can create a lot of economic value, can keep a lot of customers happy. So it's asymmetric. We can cope with lots of small failures as long as we have big successes, both in science and in the markets. In politics, it's completely the other way around. Doesn't matter how many little successes you've got, one embarrassing failure and your career's over. And politicians know that, and so it gives them totally the wrong incentives in terms of trying a diverse bunch of things, rigorously measuring what's working, because for sure something won't work, and that'll be used against you. So we've only got ourselves to blame as voters. We do it to ourselves.
Why do we do that? I mean, let's think about, if you think about the business world, Steve Jobs, who's one of the most revered and respected entrepreneurs of American or world history, he had a lot of failures. Just to take one example I always think about is the Newton, which was a palm type device. It was a lot bigger than your palm, but it was a portable device that was supposed to help you run your life, and it was a total flop. And suppose that had come along later. Suppose that was his last device, and all we had was the iPhone or some other of these other wonderful things he did. You say, well, it was a mixed bag. Of course, not everything he tried worked, but so he was great, though. He created, as you say, a lot of value, a lot of jobs, and on net, he was a wonderfully successful entrepreneur. But Alan Greenspan appears to be going down in history as a loser. He was a genius. And then all of a sudden, because of his interest rate policies of 2002 through 2004, and perhaps, I don't agree with this, but his failure to regulate subprime, I'm more likely to focus on his willingness to bail out creditors in the, say, 1995 Mexican rescue, which he supported in Congress, which I think he had other. So he's a flawed man, okay. But it's interesting. He's not he's not right, but he's not a mixed bag anymore. He's a loser. He's not just, a flawed genius. He was a failure. And so why, you say it's voters, why is it that one mistake like that, is it because we don't have the choice to opt out that we have? I didn't buy a Newton. So I don't have any anger toward Steve Jobs about the Newton. But maybe because I had to live under the regulatory policies of the Fed and the monetary policy of the Fed, I resent it. Or a president who sends our children off to die in a bad war, we don't say, he made some mistakes, he was somewhat successful. Maybe we're not so tolerant, and maybe rationally so. There's a lot more at stake. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question. I don't have a good answer. But maybe one of the things is politics is an adversarial system.
Yeah.
Business less so. So you don't have. Now, there's some needle between Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, but you didn't have Bill Gates basically running attack ads saying Steve Jobs is a loser because he produced the Newton, it's a terrible product. It just doesn't happen. And you certainly don't have, say, Bill Gates now or BlackBerry or Google with their Android phones. You don't have Steve Jobs' rivals now dragging up the Newton.
Correct.
And saying, look, he created this. And so it's partly that it's just not an adversarial system, and it's partly that, that just seems crazy. Who would pay any attention to that? But in politics, for some reason, people do.
Well,
people do. You've got people who are highly incentivized to point to any flaws and to just keep talking about it and keep talking about it, and it seems to have some effect at the polls.
Yeah, I think you unintentionally perhaps highlight, I think, what is part of the real difference. I think the adversarial thing is part of it, although there were some pretty clever adversarial ads by Apple against the PC in various times in Apple's history, currently, even recently. But I think the other part of it that comes to mind as you talk about it is the difficulty of assessing success and failure. So there's some political things that are undoubtedly failures. There's some that are undoubtedly success. But most of them are vague. And so proponents of a particular party or particular candidate will say this was a success. The other people say it's a failure. And I think it's the measurement problem. I think it's the inability. Like you say, you can paint somebody as a loser from something they did long ago. Maybe it wasn't even a failure. But in politics, it's the way, again, it's not like business where you can say, well, this was a failure. It went out of business. They stopped making it. It would be bizarre for Steve Jobs to hold up the Newton as his success. And yet, how many politicians, I'm going to go the other way from your example, hold up something they did as a success that's a failure. But because they can frame it a certain way, because people don't consume it the way they consume their own, a consumer device, there's, I think, it's another part of the problem.
Yeah, if I go out and buy a Newton or today I buy an iPad, you can bet I'm going to be paying attention as to whether it works. But as a voter, I vote. We had an election in the UK yesterday. I voted. I did my civic duty. And I didn't, I thought about the issues a bit, but I didn't really think that my vote was going to make the difference. And so I was kind of paying more attention to stuff that actually made a difference to my life. And I think that's how most voters think. They don't examine every aspect of the small print in a way that they would if they were buying a car, because the car really matters.
Yeah. Well, Brian Kaplan has written about that, and we've talked to him, and Don Boudreau writes about it a great deal as well. We're almost out of time. What would you... we've talked about the lessons for our personal lives. We've tried to talk about some policy issues, some of the challenges of introducing what your book's really about, which is trial and error. It's about the virtues of trial and error. Do you want to say anything in closing about policy in general and how we might get more trial and error? Voters are part of the problem. Psychology is part of the problem. Is there anything else that we might think about to let people try more stuff?
Well, I think it is partly about changing the intellectual climate and getting people to accept that it's okay to fail, as long as you're failing in the right way, as long as you're generating information. It's okay to experiment. This is really important. I mean, at the moment, I think we have political systems that just don't take evidence very seriously. Even people who seem to be serious-minded, so the Washington think tankers, some of them are really interested in really high-quality evidence, the kind of evidence that a doctor, an epidemiologist would take seriously. But often it's more, it's a bit hand-wavy, it's a bit vague. Partly that's the nature of the beast. It's hard to know exactly how an economy is doing. But I guess that the closing thought for me is really going back to how I start the book. I start the book in almost the same way that I started my book, The Undercover Economist, which is with a riff off Len Reid's iPencil. And at the beginning of Adapt, I talk about a toaster. I talk about a guy, a design student, who decided he was going to try and make a toaster all by himself.
Sure.
And anybody who's read Len Reid's iPencil essay knows it's not going to be very easy. And it was impossible. He made this absurd-looking thing, and he made all these kind of compromises. It's actually quite a funny story, negotiating with BP about can he fly out to an oil rig. He was trying to make plastic from potato starch, and snails ate it. I mean, he destroyed various things, microwaves, leaf blowers. He had a lot of adventures trying to make this toaster. And looking at the complexity of that product, first I leapt to the Len Reid, the pro-market conclusion, which I still believe, which is, wow, the economy is unbelievably complex, and it's this distributed system. Everybody's working together to a common goal without actually ever knowing what that common goal is, and nobody working alone could ever produce these miracles. And I still believe that. But where I really started with Adapt was just to say, but hang on, are we actually happy with every aspect of the way the world is, or have we got some problems? And if we've got some problems, it's going to mean making some changes to that incredibly complex system. And the more complex and amazing you think the system is, the more respect you give the system, the more challenging this project of actually trying to solve problems in a modern economy becomes. So it was with that sort of humbling thought that I embarked on trying to write the book and trying to explore all these things. And it's just been amazingly good fun to write.
My guest has been Tim Harford. Tim, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.